our own understandings of the American Jewish experience, and how they interact. So I assume you already know and have heard the story of American Jewish success, of our social mobility, of having achieved the American dream. No worries, that is all true. America has offered us an extraordinary, if exceptional, experience. And part of our American success story interacts with race. That part of our history is one we probably never learned. And it's one especially now that we need to know. So tonight is going to be a postgraduate seminar. It's high-level focused telling about the history of Jews and race in America. And I'm not going to strive to give both sides here because there's a single specific goal to trace the relationship between American Jews, race, and racism from 1654, which is the first settlement of Jews in North America, to the present. We're going to be investigating 3 different expressions of racism in American Jewish history. First, and fortunately these were fewer, let's say, times when American Jews actually embraced racist thoughts. But we're also going to look at times when American Jews were complicit in a system of racism, even if they were not espousing racism themselves. And most of the time, we're going to look at times when American Jews benefit from racism, whether they were trying to do that or not. So we're going to focus on white Jews, white presenting Jews, so basically Jews who look like me. We're not going to debate whether or not, white presenting Jews are actually white. That's actually for another lecture. But for today's purposes, if you're presenting as white, I'm going to use that reference. And that's because the experience of African-American Jews and other Jews of color are going to amplify what we learn today. And they offer us even more perspectives in our understandings and re-understandings of American Jewish history. So I encourage all of you to read up. There's so many really good articles and op-eds and publications and videos on the internet by Jews of color. If you want some recommendations, send me an email. I'll happy to tell you some. So here's how we're going to work today. Okay, right. For today, in response to the National Reckoning on Race, we're going to look at white European American Jews, how we experience the history and how it's shaped us till today. So it's great to be back. Here is our historical question tonight. How and why have white American Jews supported, complied, and benefit from systemic racism? For those of you taking notes, here's my thesis. The process of becoming American over time and place encouraged Jews to embrace the political and social culture around them. Regardless of time or place, that meant participation in racist systems. White Jews leveraged their privilege to achieve extraordinary success on American shores. While it is an important and heartwarming story, Jews' disproportionate participation in social justice causes and things we talked about in the last lecture did not negate the influence of their whiteness, of our whiteness, in American Jewish social mobility. So my career thesis tends to argue that Jews follow the political culture around them. I'm going to just take that thesis from last time and now apply it to the question of race. So let's talk about becoming American. Over time and place, Jews have become American. Now, in our own family stories, right, we know, well, for many of us, probably Yiddish was the original Jewish language for our immigrant ancestors. We had to learn English, and we did. We changed our religious practices. We changed our names. But one thing we've also done is racism. And by becoming American, it meant sometimes being an outright racist, sometimes being complicit in racism, and a lot of times benefiting from it. So I had a group in Orange County, California, reach out, a Jewish education group, to say, look, we would like you to give us a new lecture on the history of Jews and racism. So here's what I did. This is a book that Rabbi Gary Zola and I co-edited together a few years ago. It's just a collection of historical documents from American Jewish history from 1654 to the present. I literally just opened it up to page 1 and I just flipped through it, and I was just looking for real historical documents that related to Jews and race. And when I found them, I made photocopies, I highlighted the parts, I put it into a PowerPoint. What we're really just going to do tonight is walk through selections from this particular book. And when I say that so you understand this is actually nothing new or surprising. This is a standard textbook in college campuses where they teach American Jewish history. So if you're taking a college level course, you're going to see these documents as well. What we're not getting, though, is exposure to these documents, and we're not putting them together on the singular theme of race and coming up with a thesis like Becoming American. So in that spirit, here's the first document, actually. This is a picture of Recife, Brazil. Recife, Brazil was the town where the first American Jews came from in 1654. And from this group forward, we asked the questions, how would Jewish immigrants act in their new surroundings? When and where would racism intersect with their Judaism? So in 1776, at least, when the United States was formed, scholars argue there were 2,500 Jews. Some have said as many as 5,000 Jews. Very few. It's like 0.01% of the American population on Independence Day. Almost all these Jews were Sephardic, and they were involved in trade. And for that reason, they tended to live in ports, in port towns and port cities. Now, we're very familiar, of course, with Jews from New York and Boston and Philadelphia on the eastern seaboard. But in the colonial period, we had large concentrations of Sephardic Jews in places like Charleston, Newport, and Savannah. Here is our first document. This comes from 1713. It is a petition from an American Jew, two American Jews, actually, to the governor of New York, because they had ships that they sailed across the Atlantic, and they needed to go to Jamaica. But the problem was, in 1713, there was a boycott against trading with Jamaica. So if you're a Jewish merchant and you need to trade with Jamaica and there's a boycott, you write a letter to the governor to ask for an exception to the boycott so you can make a living. And that's the document here. I put this up because it's an easier document. The harder document is, well, what if the goods were not, perishables and things going to Jamaica? What if the goods were Africans coming from the west coast of Africa to the United States to be enslaved? If that's what you had on your ship, what's the Jewish thing to do? What's the American thing to do? What's the right thing to do? What would each of us do in that situation? Well, look, I like to think that we're all anti-slavery, and we would think that we would not participate in this. Except, and here's our first historical moment for reflection. Slavery was the law of the land in the 18th century. If you remember back to grade school, you learned about the triangle trade route across the Atlantic. It was actually dependent on slavery in order for it to work. The entire shipping industry from the United States or from colonial America was dependent on slavery. So with all of this truth happening, you have to believe colonial Jews, they did their job. And here it is, from 1762. This is a letter from Isaac Eliezer and Samuel Moses, two Jewish merchants, to the captain of a ship named John Peck. And here is what he orders the captain to do. And it's highlighted so you can read along. That you embrace the first fair wind and proceed to sea, and make the best of your way to the windward part of the coast of Africa. And at your arrival there, dispose of your cargo for the most possible can be gotten, and invest the neat proceeds into as many good, merchantable young slaves as you can, and make all the dispatch you possibly can. All right, so let's look at an analysis of this document. First of all, there has been an anti-Semitic charge by the Nation of Islam that Jews controlled the slave trade or that Jews were disproportionately involved in the slave trade. So we need to open by saying that this is false, and these are clear anti-Semitic charges. Professor Eli Faber actually wrote an entire book on the Nation of Islam charge and what Jewish participation was and was not in the slave trade. So if that's interesting to you, I encourage you to read Professor Faber's book. And for our purposes today, it's true, though, that there were some Jews who did get involved in the slave trade. On a larger scale, even beyond the colonial Jews involved in the slave trade, our community's financial success was built in part on the institution of slavery because it was systemic. It was woven into the very fabric of the colonial economy. And when you do that, it is going to be woven into the fabric of American Jewish life as well. And here's the sort of shocking part of the document in front of you. This one actually wasn't from the South at all. This came out of Newport, Rhode Island. So this, in fact, slavery was not even a regional issue because in this period, of course, it was both in the North and the South. So let's push it, shall we? What did it mean to become American if you were in the colonial South? What if you earned a comfortable living? Would you own slaves? And of course, as you can tell where this is going, yes, there were going to be Southern Jews who owned slaves. The question we want to ask today is, how would you self-reflect on your slave ownership? How could you possibly reconcile that with your Judaism? If you had to choose between enjoying your status as a white Southerner who could own slaves and your obligation as a Jew who was opposed to slavery, what is that going to look like? So I want to give a warning that the next document I put up is going to have the N word many times. I, of course, am not going to say it, but you are going to be seeing it on the screen. Here's a letter from 1762. These are actually two relatives, two cousins, Mayor Josephson writing to Michael Gratz, concerning a female domestic. And here's a piece of the letter. 1762, if you come here for the coming Sabbath Nachmu, it would please me very much, because we are presently very lonesome on the Sabbath. I also inform you that I may again sell my N-word wench at a profit. So if a ship with N-word should arrive, or a ship with indentured Germans, you will let me know because I cannot manage without a servant. The wench I now have has two virtues, both bad ones. First, she's drunk all day when she can get it. And second, she's mean, so that my wife cannot say a word to her. She's afraid of her. How did all this happen? A free N-word here wants to court her and buy her from me. I don't want to give her away for less than 110 pounds and with her bastard because I bought the bastard too. Signed, your affectionate friend, the humble Meir, son of Joseph. Wow. When I first read this document, okay, all right, so first, this is a typical letter, at least from Mayor Josephson's perspective. It's just a letter he's writing to his cousin. He does not know that a couple hundred years later, it's going to show up as a primary source document in a Zoom lecture. And what I was struck by was the fact that he integrated his Jewishness, right? He's got the Hebrew date there at the top. You can see he knows the Parsha of the week, and he talks about how lonely it is to be, to be a Southern Jew on Shabbos, and he'd like some companionship. And then, of course, the way he finishes this, your affectionate friend, the humble, right? After having used the N-word so many times, Meir, son of Yosef from Yever, scholar of blessed memory. So what this document tells us is that the Jews living in the colonial period had become American, at least what American meant for their time and place. And if you were Josephson and you were white and you were financially well enough off, then that meant that you would fully engage in the racist system of slavery. So let's move now to the early national period. This is from the Declaration of Independence, for the first few generations. And we know the Declaration of Independence promised life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to everyone. We know that the Constitution promised about a dozen years later to realize those ideas into law. But we also know, of course, that most of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence only applied to white, literate, landed men. And guess what? Jewish men in the early republic fit each of those categories. And this created a complicity in a racist system. And let's look at an example here. This is from 1809. This is the last will and testament of Samuel Jones, an American Jew. And I'll read a piece of this. After my funeral expenses and my lawful debts are paid, if I should not emancipate my Negro woman Jenny and her son Emmanuel during my lifetime, it is my desire that my executors do emancipate my Negro woman Jenny and her son Emmanuel, and to give Jenny my bed sheets, bedstead, blankets, tables, pots, plates, chairs, looking glass. To my Negro woman Jenny, $200. To Jenny, I leave of the income of the leases of $100 per year to be paid to her quarterly. And it is my further desire not to drive Jenny and her children out of my house in King Street until I have time to procure a place for their abode, unquote. So how are we going to analyze this? So the first thing is Jenny is getting more money than any organization or any other person. And you can see all the other names and numbers in there if you want to look at it. Interestingly, Jenny's son Emmanuel is also getting money in the will. And what's curious is that Jenny is getting Samuel's bed sheets. Why is he giving his bed sheets to Jenny? Because scholars believe Samuel is Emmanuel's dad. And because Jenny cannot consent to sexual relations because she is owned and in slavery, this was rape. Today, we know it's wrong for men in the workplace to have sexual relations with subordinates. We know that if there's any sort of power differential between the two, there's a problem. Well, there was the biggest possible power differential here because it was slavery. Jenny wasn't a citizen. She wasn't a person according to the law. This was not romantic love. If it was love as we understand it, Samuel would have freed her, but he didn't. If this was love, Samuel would have, moved with the family to the north where she could be free, or maybe they'd homestead in the Midwest, or maybe go to the Caribbean or Europe or anywhere where the two of them could have lived together as a married couple and as a family, but he didn't. While we think being Jewish makes us different, I argue that in America, we tend to be more the same than we like to think. Becoming American encourages us to copy those around us. And now I'll be even more pointed with this. And I'm going to ask this question for a point, which is, what's wrong with raping a Black woman you own in slavery? What a preposterous question for us today. Except Thomas Jefferson, the man who authored the Declaration of Independence, fathered multiple children with Sally Hemings, whom he owned in slavery. She could not consent either. George Washington, we know, was a slave owner, the father of our country. So when our founding fathers, our nation's quintessential Americans, owned slaves, who among us could possibly expect that American Jews in that time and in that place were going to call them out and act differently? Civil War. All right, let's start with this. Slavery is wrong and it's un-Jewish. Judaism teaches tikkun olam, my two favorite words in the English language. We need to repair the world. Our rabbis take strong social justice positions, sometimes with dissent from members of their own congregations or even their board of directors. So you know where this is going. Here it is, a rabbinic sermon by Rabbi Morris Rafal, The Bible View of Slavery, a Discourse. And here in his sermon, he tells us the story of Noah in Genesis 9:25. And here's a piece of his sermon. You and I may regret that in his anger, Noah should from beneath the waters of wrath again have fished up the idea and practice of slavery, but that he did so is a fact, and it rests on the authority of Scripture. I arrive at the conclusion that next to the domestic relations between husband and wife, parents and children, the oldest relation of society with which we are acquainted is that of master and slave. When you remember that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Job, the men with whom the Almighty conversed, all of these men were slaveholders. Doesn't it strike you that you're guilty of something very little short of blasphemy? My friends, I find, and I'm very sorry to find, that I'm delivering a pro-slavery discourse. I am no friend to slavery in the abstract, and still less friendly to the practical working of slavery, but I stand here as a teacher in Israel, not to place before you my own views, feelings, and opinions, but to propound to you the word of God, the Bible view of slavery. The result to which the Bible view of slavery leads us is, first, that slavery has existed since the earliest time. Second, that slaveholding is no sin and that slave property is expressly placed under the protection of the Ten Commandments. And third, that the slave is a person and has rights not conflicting with the lawful exercise of the rights of his owner. All right, as offensive as that sermon is, here's the shocking part if you read the top. This is a Northern rabbi. Not only that, Rabbi Rafal came from B'nai Jeshurun congregation in Manhattan. And for those of you who are engaged in synagogue life, you may have heard about B'nai Jeshurun because B'nai Jeshurun is like the hippest, most progressive, cool synagogue in America, other than the ones you go to, I'm sure. And anytime like synagogues are doing strategic planning, they always, send a few people to New York so that they can sit in and see what B'nai Jeshurun is doing. So the fact that B'nai Jeshurun of all synagogues is the one who in 1861, on the eve of the American Civil War, had a rabbi giving a pro-slavery discourse, I think helps us understand the depth at which becoming American meant embracing racist ideas. 1867, Isaac Meir Weiss, arguably the most important rabbi of the mid-19th century. He lived in Cincinnati. He was one of the founders of the Reform Movement Seminary. He had his own Jewish newspaper. And after the Civil War, he decided to go to Richmond and he took, a journal and he took notes in his journal. And when he got back to Cincinnati, he turned his journal notes into this article. And this article is his reflection on post-Civil War America and what he thinks the future of America during and after Reconstruction should be. And here's what Rabbi Weiss, the leader of the reform movement of the mid-19th century, said. As inevitable as fate, the 11 southern states are to belong to the Negroes. The enfranchisement of the Negro and the disenfranchisement of so many white men places the destiny of those states entirely in the hands of the Negro. The next consequence will be that as many white men as will possibly be able to sell out will go to the North. This again is as inevitable as fate, for the Southern man will not submit to Negro rule 1 minute longer than he must. The longevity and proliferation of the Negro in that climate gives him a natural advantage over the white race and must in time press it from these states. The next consequence of the emigration of the white will be a new immigration of Negroes from Africa. 11 Negro legislatures, the representatives of 11 states in Congress, the thinly populated country, the want of labor, the better climate than the African, the good government, the rich country. Take all these circumstances together, and you cannot deny that the Southern states in the course of 25 years will be a new Africa. The South will never be what it was. Her cotton trade is ruined. The white people will leave as fast as they can. That is the end of it. Rabbi Weiss was linked to the culture around him. The process of becoming American extended even to our highest level clergy. For Rabbi Wise, freedom for former slaves conflicted with the vision of what he wanted America to be. And now we'll move to the Industrial Revolution, the late 19th and early 20th century. Because even though Reconstruction ended in 1877, systemic racism continued. It just did it in different forms. Sharecropping replaced slavery. Lynchings maintained the terror of slave times. Poverty crimes invalidated the 13th Amendment and began what became known now as mass incarceration. While we typically think of this as Southern and not Northern, as non-Jewish rather than Jewish, the institutionalization of racism knew no such bounds. And for that, I bring you to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. And sadly, we're all most familiar with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory because of a horrific fire which occurred there in 1911. It killed 146 people, mostly Jewish women laborers. Now, we typically learn about Triangle Shirtwaist as a labor story. We learn that unsafe working conditions led to the fire. Lack of exits led to the deaths. It was built on a capitalist system that preyed on new immigrants who needed the work. Jews, we learned, were leaders of the very union movement that stepped in to help these laborers, primarily women. All good, right? Well, actually, not so much, right? Because we know it was a class problem because it was, rich factory owners against poor immigrant workers. We know it's a gender problem because Jewish women face the worst of these working conditions. But as it turns out, it was a systemic racism problem as well. In order to sew with cotton in New York City factories, they had to buy the cotton from the South. And when they bought the cotton from the South, they bought it from white landowners. And the white landowners only got it because they exploited Black sharecropping farmers in order to get it. The Northern economy could not operate. Northern Jewish immigrants could not have earned those wages without its reliance on a racist Southern economy. And here's another complication too. In the late 19th century, there were 241 textile factories in New York City. Of those 241, 234 were owned by Central European Jews. Basically, almost every single textile factory was Jewish owned. You see, and we didn't learn about this one in Sunday school, in the labor management disputes and the union fights that we learned about that Jews started, in these factories, management was Jewish. They just came from Central Europe. They were German-speaking Jews who arrived about 50 years earlier and were doing very well economically. The workers were Eastern European Jews who were just fresh off the boat and didn't have the power to protest. This was a Jew versus Jew situation. This is what becoming American meant in the turn of the century in New York City. It's not what we remember. We tend to erase the inter-Jewish part of the story. We tend to erase the sharecropping economic racism part of the story. And instead we tell the truthful part of the story, which is that a lot of the labor leaders, were Jewish and when they organized. But alas, it gets worse. And this is another Rabbi Weiss. This is Rabbi Stephen S. Weiss. And I won't read this through in the interest of time, but I'll just say that he wanted to support organized labor. And this was something that lots of rabbis did in the Industrial Revolution. He had a choice between what labor union he wanted to endorse, the American Federation of Labor or the International Workers of the World, known as the Wobblies. And in this document, he affirms the AFL and he rejects the IWW. And of course, it makes sense at the time because the IWW, the Wobblies, were communists. And he could not support a communist labor union. He wanted to support the more liberal union in the AFL, except, and you know where this is going, the AFL was a racially exclusive union, or at least a lot of its chapters were. The IWW, the Wobblies, was not racist. They integrated Black laborers into their idea. So here, when we have one of his generation's leading rabbis, Stephen S. Wise, it's more important to stay away from communism than to embrace an anti-racist attitude. Because to become American in 1999 meant you had to do that. Let's go to the New Deal of the 1930s. It was ironically a great time to be a Jew in the Great Depression. And that's because FDR brought more Jews into government, into the federal government, than any other president before him. More than that, he embraced Jewish ideas about poverty. My famous story is this guy, Isaac Rubinow. Isaac Rubinow was a Russian Jew, an immigrant who came to America, and he became an economist at Cornell University. He did really well. And in 1930, and this is, of course, only just after the stock market crash, even before the Great Depression got as bad as it did, he went to the National Conference of Jewish Social Workers. And here in 1930, he asked social workers a rhetorical question: what do we owe Peter Stuyvesant? Peter Stuyvesant was the Dutch colonial governor of New Amsterdam in 1654, and he was an anti-Semite, and he only agreed to let those first Jews stay if those Jews promised they'd never go on welfare, basically. Well, now in 1930, Rubinow is making the case that it may be time for American Jews to go on welfare. As he wrote, Jewish poverty is not a result of intergroup conditions. It is a part and parcel of the whole economic and social problem of wealth production and wealth accumulation in the country as a whole. The expectation that the problem of Jewish poverty can be met individually, meaning only by Jews helping Jews, may be hoped to be eliminated irrespective of those general economic factors, is an expression of excessive group pride, which he said was uncontrolled by scientific research and thinking. For Rubinow, becoming American meant that American Jews should be treated like everyone else in what would be the New Deal, when FDR would take over in 1933. And Rubinow, by the way, wrote part of the Social Security Act of 1935 himself. So this is fantastic time for Jews. We're involved in government. We're bringing Jewish ideas of poverty into government. American Jews are getting supported like every other citizen. Well, actually not like every other citizen, because as it turns out, the New Deal supported you unless you were Black. Because FDR, in order to get the Southern politicians to support the effort, had to let the Southern politicians decide how to spend the federal dollars. You see, if he told them how to spend the money, they would resist him because no one likes to be told what to do. But if he writes them a blank check and they get to spend it how they want, you better believe the Southern politicians would love FDR and the Democratic Party. And that's what they did. And sure enough, the Southern politicians did not give the money in any equitable way to Southern Blacks. And here's an example. In 1929, Jewish community organizations gave just a little under $2 million. We'll make that as our baseline. By 1932, it had doubled. By 1933, even a little more. So what we see here is that American Jewish organizations have such a great need to give social service support. And then look what happens in 34 and 35. The numbers are going down because now the New Deal dollars are coming in and Jewish organizations are sending, the Jewish people onto the public rolls. So here is a visual depiction of how Jews are benefiting from a system of systemic racism, even though they did absolutely nothing to do that, right? All they did was simply try to get food to eat in the middle of the Great Depression. So let's move to post-World War II America, which was a great time, again, for American Jews. Anti-Semitism plummeted between the end of World War II and 1945. By 1960, the data tells us, while sadly anti-Semitism will continue in sporadic ways, it's not holding the American Jewish community as a whole backwards. The housing covenants in the suburbs that used to be anti-Semitic, those are going away through the 1950s. The GI Bill gave 500,000 Jewish veterans and their families new opportunities for college, for home loans, mortgages, small business loans. It was fantastic. Except Levittown. You may be familiar, there are actually several Levittowns from the first one in Pennsylvania. And this was a Jewish real estate developer, William Levitt, who had the idea that you could mass produce houses in suburban areas and bring the cost way down. And with this, American Jews could leave urban America and apartments, and they could go into suburbs and have backyards. And thanks to the economic expansion and college educations and, it was great. Well, here is the oral history of one of the early Jewish residents of Levittown. It was the talk of the Jewish community in Philadelphia, because who would think of buying a house with $1,000 down or $500 down? Levittown became a heavily Jewish-seeking area because immediately Levitt gave a beautiful piece of property to the conservative synagogue. Eventually, they gave ground to the Reform congregation too. I never experienced any discrimination in Levittown because I'm a proud Jew. But as a matter of fact, my mission is to educate not only the Jews, but the Christians. Most of my friends who are Christian, I teach them Bible. So I don't hide the fact that I'm Jewish, unquote. No discrimination in Levittown? Guess what? Levittown was racially exclusive. Even after the Supreme Court ruled against these restrictive housing covenants based on race in 1948, there were still informal ways that white suburbs remained white suburbs. When this person said there's no discrimination in Levittown, he meant there's no anti-Semitism, because there was a whole lot of discrimination in Levittown in the form of racism. In fact, in those early years, Jews were signing covenants where they promised not to resell their homes to Blacks. So here's a case when achieving the American dream, right? Getting your house in the suburbs is actually complicity in racist housing. Jews jumped over Blacks in their exodus from the cities to the suburbs. Supporting home ownership meant supporting racism. And I think we talked a little bit about it in the last lecture. This is actually sowing the seeds of the end of the Black-Jewish alliance, because Black Americans who are remaining behind, and a lot of times in apartment buildings still owned by Jews, are seeing the difference between what it means to be Jewish, white Jewish in America in the 1950s and what it means to be Black. All right, I want to bring you all back to something in education we called a film strip. I'm actually old enough to remember film strips. You may remember film strips too. And in 1954, the UAHC, the Reform Movement, now the Union for Reform Judaism, had a film strip celebrating the 300th anniversary of American Jewish life. And on a talk like this, it's hard to have a favorite slide, a favorite image, but this would be mine, because here you see a visual depiction of American Jewish history. And if a picture can tell 1,000 words, I love this picture because look who's at the beginning. The pilgrim is at the beginning, right here in the very front. And then, maybe that's Thomas Jefferson. That's like one of the founding fathers. That to me looks like Davy Crockett. Two back there, I don't know, like Abraham Lincoln. And somewhere back there, right, these are the American Jews, right? This is like 1954. So forget that American Jewish history started in 1654 or 1847 or 1880, the three migrations. We're going to go back to the pilgrims in this image to show when our history in this country starts. Jews are real Americans. And in this case, we're fully integrated. My question for all of us today, what are the consequences of us as Jews to internalize an origin story that begins with the pilgrims? What does that say for us as Jews? What does it say for us as Americans? What does it mean that we had a multimedia film strip in 1954 that had this picture in it? Because Black Americans could not have this film strip. They could not represent themselves back to the pilgrims because of slavery. In fact, even in the Jewish community, among Jews of colors, Black Jews, Latinx Jews, Indigenous Jews, could certainly not use this image. So I would say that this picture, this image tells us a whole lot more than we imagined. So let me just ask for those who are here, I'm not sure, did we do this document in our last talk on the segregated school system? So what I'll do, because some of you may have seen this and some of you not, I'll walk through this a little bit more quickly than we did last time if we covered this. This is a testimony to the United States Senate Subcommittee on Education. And the federal government wanted to support public schools. So here was somebody saying, let's support public schools with federal dollars. And this person said, a segregated system is not merely unfair, but it's wasteful and inefficient. Nevertheless, we do not believe that a federal law to equalize educational opportunities by public subsidy should be used as a means to attack the segregated school system. So long as the law guarantees that states having segregated school systems do not discriminate financially against children in the minority schools, we believe the bill should be supported. And for those of you who went to law school, you may be familiar with this, because in 1954, the Brown decision said that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. And when that passed in 1954, they were actually overturning the 1896 Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. In the Plessy case, they argued, and this was interstate trains, that you could have racially segregated train cars as long as you gave the same amount of money to the black car as the white car. Well, first of all, they never gave the same amount of money, but as Brown taught us, even when they did, it's still unequal. So look here. So long as the law guarantees that the states having segregated school systems do not discriminate financially, we believe this bill should be supported. This is a Plessy versus Ferguson argument. This is against the Brown decision. This is the view of white Southern Jim Crow bigoted senators. So let's take a look at him. Here he is. Oh my goodness, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise is back in 1947. Stephen S. Wise, the leader of the Free Synagogue of New York, probably the most important rabbi of his generation. How on earth could he be a segregationist, racist before the US Senate? And here's the backstory. He went down to get more money for schools. That's a really good rabbinic thing to do. And after he gave his testimony, the white bigoted senators came up to him and said, Rabbi, they said, we know what's going to happen if federal dollars come to the South. You're going to try to undo Jim Crow. And we'll have nothing to do with that. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to put an amendment to the bill. The amendment says none of the dollars can do anything to change the racial status quo. And they said to the rabbi, we need you to support the amendment. And by the way, if this amendment doesn't pass, the Southern senators will filibuster the bill. It will never leave committee. No children anywhere in America will get any money. So what do you do if you're Stephen S. Wise? Now you have an impossible moral choice. Do you want some kids to get some money or no kids to get no money? And here's what he does. He opens by saying a segregated system is not merely unfair, but it's wasteful and inefficient. That's his way of letting everyone know he doesn't personally agree with Jim Crow. But then the word nevertheless. He makes his moral compromise. He agrees to the resolution, and that is called liberal gradualism. The idea that in order to bring social change, sometimes we have to do it step by step. You can't get everything at once. Better to get as much money as you can to as many kids as you can, even if you know you can't help Black kids in the South. All right, just for historical fun, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was 18 years old when this happened. Let's put him in that subcommittee meeting. Let's have the white racist senators ask him to make the deal. Would he have agreed to the amendment? And I argue no way. Because if your goal is racial justice, that amendment not only doesn't help you, it hurts you because it actually affirms Jim Crow in federal law by having an amendment that the money's not going to affect the racial status quo. And here is where Rabbi Stephen S. Wise enjoyed privilege of being Jewish, being white in this case, and he was able to take a more gradual approach. And I would argue that that decision is sort of a metaphor for a lot of what we're dealing with in American society now over the terms of how quickly or slowly we're going to go on social change and sort of who can afford to move slower or not. Okay. Um, this is not actually in my, hold on one moment. It's not in the book, but I wanted to put it in here. This is some of the handwritten letter from a Birmingham jail that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote. And I wanted to read you a piece of it because I think it's really an important document. The letter from a Birmingham jail was written actually the day after clergy and a rabbi published a full-page ad in the newspaper telling Dr. King, look, we get that you want racial equality, we want racial equality too, but Dr. King, slow down. Slow down because you're causing too much trouble with your protests, and we think in the South it will be better if we have a more gradual approach. And here is what Dr. King wrote back to the clergy, which included a rabbi. I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom, it's not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but it is the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, well, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama, a few years ago, I felt we'd be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, the priests, the rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. End quote. This, I think, is a challenge we face today. How much have we as sort of Jewish social justice advocates, right, followed the pattern that King described? And this would be what we're getting a lot now today. This is the definition of racism as not being an anti-racist. This is where good-hearted liberalism means complicity in racism. So I want to move away from the history reader and talk about the contemporary period. Since the civil rights movement ended, the fight against racism moved north. Whites-only neighborhoods were created without even needing Jim Crow laws. Whites-only schools existed without challenges from the Brown decision. When integration and busing came, Jews pulled kids from public schools and opened Jewish day schools. When Black power demanded real equality instead of just legal rights, Jews retreated and fought for Soviet Jews instead. When Jews faced anti-Israelism and anti-Zionism and sometimes even anti-Semitism from a new generation of Black activists, they retreated from the front lines and built their own ethnic revival. And it all came crashing together in the Black Lives Matter movement. This is the #1 question I get on all of my Zoom lectures, even if my Zoom lecture isn't even about it. So I'll pause from the history and reflect on what I'm learning because the questions come up so much. So I reached out to friends of mine in the Black Jewish community and friends of mine who are engaged in Black Lives Matter work themselves to get their responses. Some Jews are opposing Black Lives Matter because some of its leaders are anti-Zionist. There is an anti-Zionist and I think arguably an anti-Semitic statement that's included in the nearly 40,000 word statement from the Movement for Black Lives. Many Jews have demanded a retraction of anti-Zionism as a condition for their support. But when we do this, we're telling people of color to sort of you change your views, or we'll take our social justice ball, and go home. In this case, we're leveraging our white privilege, the power we have, to force Black Americans to change their views. And as Evan Traylor teaches us, we're holding all Blacks accountable for what only a few are saying. And it turns out that we get to sort of make this ultimatum only because America has privileged us over the last few centuries to be in a position where our power actually matters. So I argue, let's not use the power we have to step back from racial justice work. Instead, let's not miss the point. And the point is that Black lives matter. So let's join together, right? Show our willingness to leverage our power in order to help racial equality, to sit side by side once again, like we did in the 50s and 60s, across racial and religious lines. And a good place for us to start, and probably a lot of you may have already had experience with this, is among Jews of color. Their absence from organized Jewish life reflects the many subtle and not so subtle ways that racism permeates our synagogues, our JCCs, and other Jewish organizations. Do white Jews ever get asked or demanded to explain how they became Jewish, when they walk into a Jewish space? Do white Jews ever get asked to be served another helping of Shabbat dinner because you're just assumed to be the custodial staff? Do white Jews ever get told that their very synagogue name tag doesn't belong to them because with a name like that, you can't be Black or brown or Asian American? Jews of color rejection of organized Jewish life is actually our problem. It's our problem because we created it and we perpetuated it. It's also our problem because it's an opportunity. How welcoming are our synagogues if a Black or brown Jew has to think about making an approach because we have an armed guard or even an unarmed guard standing there? How much do we lose when our Jewish community doesn't get to benefit from what we estimate now to be the 12 to 15% of Jews of color who do exist and are practicing Judaism? They're just doing it in different spaces. While humanity and Judaism demand that we address systemic racism for our fellow Jews, for Jews of color, we also need to understand that we're addressing it for ourselves, because ultimately I think all of us lose if we don't get to enjoy Jewish life with everybody who is already Jewish today. So to end on a hopeful note, this moment, it offers us an incredible opportunity for a new approach to racial justice. By seeing what has been invisible to us in American Jewish history, we can begin to see what has been vivid for African Americans and other communities of color their entire lives. By letting go of our closely guarded version of American Jewish history, we can begin to see the backside of our social mobility, the negative consequences of our success. That knowledge, that consciousness is where we need to be to start the process of dismantling a system that is privileging white Jews over communities of color. And when we do that in the best possible way, we're going to prove Dr. King wrong about what it is to be a Jewish moderate. And we're going to prove him right about his vision for the future of America. So I thank you so much. And I'm happy to hand it over to our leader for however you'd like to proceed.
Thank you. I am sure I speak for all of us when I say that was another superb and engaging lecture, and it was much, much appreciated. We did have a couple of questions and comments that have already come over the chat. And one of them was, what about Native Americans?
Okay, what about Jewish or in what way?
This was by Anita Levin. Anita, if you want to maybe unmute yourself and elaborate.
Yeah, I had this question at the point in time when you showed the start of white American history being from the Pilgrims. Right. So we skipped what we've done as Americans who think we're natives when in fact we're immigrants to the people who were here before us.
Right, thank you. It's an excellent point. And for the focus on this talk, I really wanted to look at the intersection of Jews and colonialism. put it that way. And in that case, I would argue that that applies to indigenous tribes as well, because the advent of colonialism in North America, created, dispossession, certainly among indigenous peoples, and then the forced migration of Africans into slavery. So that's a great topic, and I really didn't cover it for this talk.
A comment that came through from Stuart Shevin was, one must put Rabbi Grafman's involvement in the letter to Martin Luther King Jr. in Birmingham into perspective. Grafman was plagued by being branded as a racist for this, but it is not his full story. For instance, listen to Grafman's sermon to his congregants after the 16th Street bombing. The audio is available online.
Thank you. Great point, Stuart. And I had to engage in hopeless reductionism to get through 350 years in an hour. Grafman, and I wrote about him in my first book, is just an excellent example of what it is to be a social justice minded rabbi in the South, in the middle of the civil rights movement. Alan Krauss of blessed memory actually did personal interviews with Rabbi Grafman in 1965. If you're interested, I can get you the citation on his book, it was posthumously published, and he's got a whole lot of stuff there, and that's where I actually went to when I was able to write about him. And what I mean to show, and I think Grafman is excellent, I want to extend the thesis to everybody, right? I want you to be as disgusted by Jewish slave owners in some of those documents as you are understanding what it was like to be them in their time and place. And that the thesis here is not like good versus evil. The thesis is, what does it mean to become an American? And how do each of us sort of navigate the unintended consequences of achieving success? And when you have a system of racism, that's how it goes. So, I wanted to sort of keep seeing that all the way through. Clearly in 2020 and in 2021, we're not facing the questions they had in the 1700s and 1800s, but I think we're facing the similar challenge of asking ourselves sort of how are we situated and relative to questions of race, and what do we need to do about it?
A question that I had is, you mentioned that a lot of the first Jews in the United States and in the Americas in general were Sephardic and not Ashkenazi. And my question is, was their presence here the product of their being expelled from Spain and Portugal and other Spanish countries? And if so, did that inform their opinions on slavery and becoming slave owners, having been an oppressed people in their own country?
That is a great question. I have not actually studied it, so I can't give an authoritative answer, but I can answer from the hip, right? Which is that my thesis is, it doesn't actually matter what kind of Jewish person you are, because if you're a white male Jew in the South with money, chances are you're going to buy somebody and enslave them. And my argument is that not one's Jewish faith isn't going to undo that. And I wanted to show you that even rabbinic leaders were finding a Jewish defense of exactly doing that, because I wanted to show how becoming American actually is the dominant theme, even though I think we would hope and love that our sense of justice and our read of Torah would cause, because I think today we all disagree, of course, with all of that. But that's a great question on Sephardic history.
Are there any other questions for Professor Dollinger before we end our presentation tonight?
I'd like to say something.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
This is Mike Haskey, and I've had the privilege of studying with Debbie Mays, who is a professor of Sephardic history at the University of Michigan. And her area of specialty is the Ottoman Empire, which had both slavery and polygamy. And she said that one of the things that was interesting was that Jewish men, successful men, frequently had domestic slaves working in their household. And the Jewish women, the wives, encouraged them to satisfy their sexual desires with the slave women because if they felt that they had to marry them when they were often younger and more attractive than their older wives, they might be tempted to marry them, and that would require an adjustment in their wills so their second wives could also get an inheritance.
All right, wow. Thank you for sharing that. Wow. I haven't studied the Ottoman Empire either, but it looks as if what it means to belong means a lot. So, wow. And Rebecca just asked a great question about whether servant and slave in Torah has different interpretations. Great question. And now I'll give you the other side. When we did the document reader, we had a Northern rabbi take a biblical defense of slavery, and then we had a Southern rabbi take a biblical opposition to slavery. And we put the two sermons side by side in the book. And it's meant for the students to get completely confused on what it is. So yes, there is also an anti-slavery discourse. The Southern rabbi who did that, and he actually wrote it specifically because he didn't like what Rafal wrote, his congregation threatened to tar and feather him for having written his opposition to slavery, and he had to physically leave the congregation and spent the rest of his career in the North in order to do that. So yes, one can find subtleties in what's known as servant and slave. As well.
I have a quick question, if I can, Professor. It was a very interesting presentation for the hour. Were there parallels to this story in other countries where Jews settled?
Yeah, so we call that transnational history. Excellent question. For the most part, no, only because Jews were not in a position of that much privilege for most of our history. So if you take Europe in the medieval period, right, the Jews were living in ghettos. So Jews were actually the other. Jews weren't, even though Jews had white skin, they were not considered white. And of course, we know in modern Europe that Jews were considered subhuman, and that led to the Shoah, to the Holocaust. There is an argument that South American Jews in the 1600s were actually better off than even Jews in what would be the United States. I don't know specifically if Brazilian Jews, for example, owned slaves when slavery came to Brazil. I'll check in with some of my colleagues. It would not surprise me to learn that they did.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions before we end this evening? Well, again, thank you so much, Professor. We really, really appreciate you coming back. And like I said, giving us our last lecture of this year. We hope you will join us again at some point, as we have all really, really enjoyed your lecture. And we hope all of you will join us in 2021 for our slate of programming. You all received a save the date email, and invites will be going out for each of the programs very, very soon. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Professor. Good night.
Take care. Thank you, everyone. Happy Hanukkah.
Good
Happy
night. Thank
Hanukkah.
you. Thank you.